California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. You know that there is a little bit more to making a podcast than talking into a mic and hitting publish. You need a little bit more than that. And I'm talking about a reliable hosting service so your time can be spent working on your show. You also want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a webpage that's simple and easy to work with. That's why I use BLUBRRY. With its simple media hosting and a fully integrated WordPress website, it can't get any easier. If you host a show or you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitalJigsaw.com/stream to give BLUBRRY a try for a month for free. BLUBRRY's support team will be right there with you every step of the way to help you migrate over. You won't lose any of your subscribers in the process either. And if you're new to this, they can get your show up and running. And with a month for free to try it out using promo code DREAM, what have you got to lose? There are a number of ways you can support California Dreaming. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can spread the word about the show. You could recommend us in podcast and true crime fan groups. And you can leave the show a rating and review on iTunes or whichever platform you listen to the show on. And if you would like to go a little above and beyond, you can also support the show on our Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to one exclusive episode per month, and there are currently more than 24 episodes that you can binge. So it's a pretty good deal for just $1. Because of the 4 episodes on Kevin Cooper that I did recently, and the bonus episode on Brenda Gary, and this bonus that you're listening to now, I'm going to take a few days off to catch up on all my thank you cards that I need to mail out to patrons. I haven't mailed any since August, so I'm going to take care of that this weekend, and I'm also going to have your October bonus episode up on Patreon soon as well. This week, I'd like to thank Richard M., Tomaz R., Iwona J., Lauren, Margaret S., Angie F., Diane M., Eric S., Thomas M., Kenny P., Ali B., Jade D., Terry S., and Chapico M. for becoming new patrons and supporting the show. I would also like to thank Brandy K., Sandra C., Heather S., Amber, Crystal Mack, Randy M., and Belky G. for raising your support to the next tier. And also Anna and Jen T. for coming back to Patreon. And if you're not interested in a monthly donation, you can help with a one-time donation to the show through our PayPal using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Every little bit helps in keeping us going and ad-free, so thank you. So this week we're doing things a little bit different. If all goes well, this episode should be a recorded conversation between myself and Kate over at the Ignorance Was Bliss podcast. We have been talking about discussing a serial killer for quite some time now. I think pretty much ever since we did our last collaboration on the dating game killer Rodney Alcala. But it's taken us this long to get ourselves together in order to do this. So for right now, I'm going to drop in our audio recording of our conversation. And the reason why I said if all goes well, because when I recorded this, I wasn't sure when it was going to happen. But it happened. So we had a conversation regarding a prolific serial killer who terrorized the area of South Los Angeles in the 1980s, then inexplicably took a break and suddenly resurfaced to commit another murder in 2002, another in 2003, and committing his last known killing in 2007. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Kate for this special bonus episode of California Dreaming in collaboration with Ignorance Was Bliss, the tale of the Grim Sleeper.
Okay. Hey, this is Kate from Ignorance Was Bliss, and I have the wicked, exciting, incredible honor of recording with Roseanne today.
Hi, Roseanne here from California Dreaming, and thank you so much for wanting to do this episode with me. We've been talking about this forever, and we're finally getting around to it. I'm really happy to discuss this case with you because it's a really compelling case.
Yeah, I mean, I've been nagging at you for like a year, like basically from the moment we hung up the last time. I've been like, let's do that again. So yeah,
right.
Yeah, very
right.
cool.
Originally, we were going to talk about a different serial killer, but at the last minute, I changed it up because what I've been getting from the listeners is that they're kind of they've heard a lot about the other serial killer we were going to discuss. So I decided this might be more interesting for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. And I think as well, there's a little bit more to talk about in terms of like society and procedures involved in this case. The other one was handled comparatively well. This one was handled comparatively not.
Right. And a little bit later on in the middle of all this, I do discuss that other serial killer because they actually were active at the same time. So I'll get into both of those investigations and how they compared a little bit later on. But if you want to get started, our story today begins on August 10th, 1985. It is the date that the first known confirmed victim of the serial killer who would become known as the Grim Sleeper was discovered. And I first want to tell you about each of the 10 victims based on information I found in an article that was written in May of 2016 by Haley Branson Potts entitled The Grim Sleeper's Victims. They were young, vulnerable, and at times ignored. So the first victim, her name was Deborah Jackson. She was a 29-year-old cocktail waitress and the mother of 3. She was shot 3 times in the chest. Her body was found Saturday, August 10th, 1985, in an alleyway near Westgate Avenue in South Los Angeles, hidden under a discarded piece of carpet. At the time, because Los Angeles was basically under siege, there was a lot of street crime, much of it drug-related. The murder rate in the city was extremely high, and it would be another 3 years before police would begin piecing together what exactly it was they had here, starting with Deborah's killing. That they didn't realize it, but they started to realize it after about 3 victims in, that they did have a serial killer on their hands. So law enforcement, they weren't putting the word out there on the streets that young African-American women were at risk of being targeted by a potential serial killer, which could have potentially saved some of these women's lives if they had been warned. Now, what?
I mean, I'd say it might have, but I mean, anytime early on, it's really hard to spot a pattern. So this is sort of the only time when I will give the police a little bit of leeway, is that when a serial killer first starts behaving actively.
Fair enough.
You know, it can be hard to know, like, are these just similar crimes, or is there enough in common that these are the same person?
Right. Well, what and how much the LAPD knew at the time between 85 and 88 isn't really clear, because they're not, but what is known is they're not going to the media and warning the public vigorously. It's very likely that some of these murders were being categorized along with other random gang-related street crimes that were plaguing the city at the time. So victim number 2 happened a little more than a year later. She was 35-year-old mother of 5, Henrietta Wright. She was discovered shot 2 times in the chest on Tuesday, August 12, 1986, also in an alleyway in the Hyde Park area of Los Angeles. She was wrapped in a light green blanket and covered with a mattress, and she had a man's T-shirt stuffed in her mouth. The chief of detectives at the time of the LAPD's division that patrolled that area said that they didn't have any suspects. The only thing they knew for sure was she was killed somewhere else and transported to the alley where she was left. Her death was not linked to Deborah's death immediately, despite its similarities. So shortly after, 2 days later, a third victim who was male and is believed to be the only male victim linked to the Grim Sleeper was a 36-year-old man named Thomas Steele, and he was discovered shot 1 time behind his right ear on August 14, 1986. It's believed he was either a friend or an acquaintance of one of the victims who might have become aware of the killer's identity and that he was murdered in order to silence him.
Do you know if he was the only one who was not shot in the chest?
As far as the early victims are, yes. He was the only one shot in the head. All the other victims in the 80s were shot in the chest, and I have a theory on why that is. When he resurfaced in the 2000s, he started off with strangulation as his means of killing them. He didn't use a gun. It was his final victim that he used a gun again.
Right. Yeah, okay. Just, I had missed that early on.
Oh, yeah.
where the man was shot, and there's an interesting little detail right there.
It is interesting because I don't think he had any intentions of doing anything to the guy other than killing him, whereas the rest of them were shot in a manner where they were not going to die quickly, I believe. That he wanted to incapacitate them so he could have them alive for a period of time.
I hate this guy. Like, I just put that out there. Like, this guy's awful.
It's really sick. No, I don't think any of them died right away except for this guy. So the fourth victim was 23-year-old Barbara Ware. She was discovered on Saturday, January 10th, 1987, also in an alleyway in the Central Alameda area of Los Angeles, South Los Angeles. She suffered one gunshot wound to the chest. When she was left, she had a plastic garbage bag partially covering her upper body and her head. And there was actually someone who witnessed Barbara being left there. Did you read about that?
Yeah, I don't remember the name.
It was
of
a 911 call. It was
right.
Anonymous. It was a 911 call.
Anonymous.
Yeah. It was a 911 call that came in at 12:20 in the morning to report that he had seen someone leaving a body, and he provided the address of the location. And in a partial transcript of his call, he said that someone threw her out, and the only thing that was hanging out were her feet, and that he threw a gas tank on top of her. And he provided a license plate number of the vehicle that left her there. And it was reported that it was a blue and white Dodge with the license plate number IPZP746. That van was located at a church about 4 miles away from where Barbara was left, about an hour after the 911 call was made. But beyond that, there was very little investigation into it. They questioned some of the church members, and they were like, a lot of people have access to the van. I don't think that the LAPD were taking this case as seriously as they should have. By now we're at, the third female being shot in the chest, and with so many murders on their hands. And I don't even know what they thought of these women, if they had already known that they had a record for being sex workers or whatever the case. They didn't follow the lead with the van as much as I think they should have, because that was a pretty good lead. Now, there is a possibility that the 911 caller was actually the killer himself. That happens. Sometimes killers do that, right?
Right. This is my grand art, and you're not noticing. And so clue in. And they also kind of want to test the police to be like, how, it's like, it's a little bit like a kid, what happens when I do this? What happens when I do that? And so it could have been a matter of the van went by at the same time and some confusion happened on which vehicle it was which. Mm-hmm. It's hard to know, but absolutely. If you have a van and a license plate, like, sure, a lot of people have access, but it's not an infinite pool of people who have access.
Exactly. So if you can get on YouTube and listen to parts of this 911 call, and when the 911 operator asks for his name, he laughed and he's like, I'm staying anonymous. He knows a lot of people. Okay, bye-bye. And he hung up. And it was kind of unsettling to hear him laugh about finding a dead body. I thought it was weird. That's why I kind of thought perhaps it might be the killer. I don't know. People act weird on 911 calls sometimes.
Well, and nervous laughter too. Like it's been a while since, like I said, I know that I've heard it, and I couldn't remember if they gave a first name. I felt like they did, but I'm wrong on that. But something sounds off about the call to me, but I don't know if it's him or somebody who knows him.
Possibly. Apparently the police did impound the van and they searched it, but they didn't find anything inside that indicated anything violent had taken place or any blood. If it was really actually the killer who called, it might have been an attempt to throw investigators off his trail with this red herring, the van.
Right. And so, in that case, all he has to do is know there is a van that a lot of people have access to. I'm gonna drop this as a clue when it's not,
right. The fifth victim was 25-year-old Bernita Sparks, and she was discovered dead with one gunshot wound to the chest. She had some signs of strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. And she was discovered on Thursday, April 16th, 1987. She told her mom she was headed out to buy a pack of cigarettes and never came home. And it was later that same day that police reported seeing her body, that a call came into police reporting her body. She was found in a trash bin covered with trash. Now, the one thing that was different about the way Bernita was left, she was the first victim to have been thrown into a trash bin as opposed to being left in an alley covered up by nearby trash. So it did have investigators beginning to rethink the serial killer theory, not only because of the location of her body, but because she had more injuries aside from the gunshot wound. She had the strangulation marks on her neck, and she had some blunt force trauma to her head. So I kind of started wondering why this one was different. Now, to me, the Grim Sleeper seemed sort of like a lazy killer, for lack of a better way of describing it. He didn't want to put much effort into what he was doing. He preyed on women who were alone and vulnerable. He didn't seem to try to force anyone into his car. He was offering rides and they were accepting, or he was picking up sex workers. He preferred using his unassuming appearance. He was kind of a relatively small guy in stature. Women felt at ease around him, that he wasn't threatening or menacing in any way. And he didn't really want to have to bother with exerting any great amount of energy or effort in fighting against them if they struggled while he attempted to force women into his car. It didn't happen that way. And of course, this is my own conjecture based on what the woman who survived had said and his MO that was, laid out years later. Once the women were in his car, he continued to exert a minimal amount of effort when it came to injuring these women or incapacitating them. He would just reach for his gun and shoot them in the chest. And from the looks of it, he appeared to make sure that the wounds he inflicted would not be rapidly fatal, so they would to some extent still be conscious or at the very least alive and breathing. And it was at this point that he would sexually assault them, and he would take pictures as well. Then once he was done, he would drive around to these alleyways and he would look for a place to leave them that was nearby some trash that he could use to cover the body. He would drive up and either park or open the door, push the victim out, or he would go around and pull the victim out and then drag whatever discarded trash he found in the alley on top of them and drive away. So I just thought it was like really him either being really weak or unwilling to fight or unable to fight women.
Well, or to me, that's just more that's not part of the fantasy. That's not part of the high. Is that there are people out there who want their victims to struggle and hurt and bleed and fight back because they get off on this feeling of being stronger and bigger and whatever. And then there are other people who that's not part of the high. The part of the high is some other aspect of the assault. Like in his case, I don't think hand-to-hand combat or brute force was what did it for him. I think he probably found that distasteful in a way, okay. I guess, for lack of a better word. He also sounds like he was fairly impulsive with it. Like, this is not a guy who sat around plotting his next kill and then following through in a careful way. This sounds like somebody who's like, I'm in the moment, here we go, and we're off. So think more Jeffrey Dahmer and less Bundy.
Mm-hmm. Right. I understand what you're saying. I just thought he was lazy.
Well, I mean, to a degree, yeah, but
I just think he didn't want to break a sweat.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is that may just not be what gets him off.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying. You're probably right.
There are some people who take great pride in their own sang-froid, their own cold-bloodedness.
Right.
And so that may be what he was after, was this feeling of, I can do anything without breaking a sweat. Like, I'm taking out the trash, that kind of horrible, horrible mindset.
Right, right. Well, for the differences in Bernita Sparks' case, though, which strayed from his usual MO with the strangulation and then beating her about the head and then lifting her into a dumpster, which was more than he normally did. So I was like, well, why is that? I thought maybe he was more angry at her, or maybe she fought back more than the others did.
He may have had more time. He may have seen that things were more isolated, or he believed that he was in a more isolated way, so he could take a little more time. He may have known her, and so he felt the need to take an extra step to hope that her body wasn't found.
Right. I still think that whatever differences there were plenty of similarities for investigators to have made the connection to the previous killings. I don't think they should have written off the serial killer theory this fast.
You know, and the reason for it was that there was a fundamental flaw in the sort of understanding and approach to what a serial killer was at that time. And so they had this very strong, so there's signature and there's MO, modus operandi. Mm-hmm. And so MO is what you do to get the job done. It's the basics. It's the using a gun, strangulation, blunt force trauma. And then it's also like how you dispose of the victim afterward. Mm-hmm. Signature is anything extra that you do that doesn't technically need to be done as part of the act, but you feel like sort of compelled to do it. So Boston Strangler tied things around the victim's necks in a bow, for instance.
Right.
And, you know, Bundy went for a very specific looking victim, and he went through this sort of elaborate ruse in public of like appearing injured to get them in his car, or acting like a cop to get them in his car, that kind of thing. Things that he didn't technically have to do, because he could have gotten women into his car in less elaborate ways if he'd wanted to. So with this guy, like, so I guess to word it better, at the time in the 80s, they were just sort of barely starting to understand the idea of tracing and trapping for serial killers, and understanding that there are patterns that you can follow through. And I think they leaned too heavily on the idea that MO and signature were basically the same thing. Right. And as this guy proves, MO can evolve and change. Mm-hmm. So he may learn, you know, like it may be fundamentally that he really wants to try strangulation, but he knows that a gun will work. And so he starts with a gun and he sticks with that because that's what works for a while. And then he starts sort of experimenting. You know, the horrible thing about serial killers is that this is their art. So picture it like if Monet were to work in watercolors first and then move on to oil painting, it would still be Monet. There would still be aspects of his art that are fundamentally there, but he's changed MO.
Right.
Right. And so that's what this feels like, is that they got a little too stuck on like, well, he disposed of the body differently, it must be a different person.
Right. I thought maybe he changed it around because he was feeling different emotionally towards the victim.
You know, he might have, but if, you know, it's hard to, like, I don't actually want to, I don't want to know what's in this guy's head specifically, but, right. But you know, there's a lot, my point is that, like, we can't know now what was in his head and why he made the change, and police in the moment were, and that's because right now we're coming from this understanding a little bit more of how complex serial killers can be and what their actions are. And so back then they tended to believe that all serial killers fit a more specific mold. And so I think that they just sort of, oh, that, you know, the guy disposed of the victim differently, it must not be the same guy, wipe it away. And like, they didn't stop and think, like, is there any other possible explanation that could make this the same person?
Right. Okay, so his sixth victim was 26-year-old receptionist Mary Lowe. On Saturday, October 31st, 1987, she told her mom she was headed to a Halloween party at a place called The Love Trap. It was like a bar. Her mom recalled in an interview that she told her daughter that it was a little bit crazy of her to want to go out because there was a heavy downpour that night, and determined to celebrate Halloween, she went anyway. She was discovered the next morning in an alleyway near the 8900 block of Western in the Gramercy Park area of South Los Angeles. She was somewhat obscured by some bushes this time, and she had been shot once in the chest. A neighbor reported witnessing Mary get into the car with a black man driving a orange Ford Pinto the night before. So now they have a car. And I asked around about how popular Pintos were because I couldn't really find any information about their distribution at the time. And it seems like it was a pretty popular car in the 70s and 80s. But I can't help but think that this is a lead that could have been chased down if the LAPD had really, put their boots on the ground and got some guys out there investigating who has an orange Pinto living in South Los Angeles. The man who would later become identified as the Grim Sleeper was pretty well known in his community, and for years he drove around in an orange Pinto. And if police had put out a bulletin to be on the lookout for a 20 to 30-something black man with an orange Pinto with red racing stripes, then they might have put two and two together.
I mean, that's an awfully specific car. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They had this information from a witness, and it wouldn't be the first time. The next, he's going to have a survivor, and she's going to say the same thing in a couple more victims from now. So this was totally something police would do today. They would do that today. If they saw a car, they would have it everywhere, a description of it. And it's not happening in this case. And we could talk more about it in a little bit, but I want to finish up with the victims here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the seventh victim was 22-year-old Lucretia Jefferson. She was discovered dead on January 30th, 1988. She was shot twice in the chest and left in an alleyway in Lenox. She was fully clothed and covered by a mattress, which was, the MO. And there was a different thing about this one is that there was a napkin placed over her face with the word AIDS written on it, like AIDS, which the police have no idea what that means. Do you have any clue what that could be about?
I mean, if it was left by him, it could have been a red herring, or it could have been an expression of what was really going on in his head. Most serial killers have some sort of twisted view of why what they're doing is okay. And so in the 80s, the AIDS crisis was huge. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, that AIDS. And people were terrified because we were just starting to understand what it was. We were just starting to become aware that it, other than, because for a long time it was called the gay cancer. And
right. And it was also something that seemed that people not only associated with people being gay, but also intravenous drug users. And that would include possibly some of these victims, or he wanted to at least maybe put that out there, like you said.
Well, that's what it started as, in the 70s, it was called the gay cancer. And then it evolved to realize that people could get it through IV drug use. And then in the 80s, that's when it started to become more and more clear that you could get it through casual sex. So people started to really freak out about, could you get it from using the same toilet? Could you get it from kissing? Could you get it from them coughing in the same room as you? People really didn't have a concept of what this disease was. And there was a ton of stigma, and there was a ton of blame and nastiness around this. So if it was the guy, if it was Franklin eventually who left this there, to me, that's a sign of, here's my excuse.
Yeah,
is that I assume this is a sex worker and I assume she is spreading AIDS. But it could have been somebody else. It could have been it could have been stuck to the bottom of the mattress.
Yeah, right.
So it's really hard to know, whether this is a related clue or not.
Yeah. So if we're keeping track up to this point, she is the seventh victim, but she's the sixth woman found in a 29-month period of time that was shot and left in an alley in such a way. So victim number 8 was 18-year-old Alicia Alexander. She was discovered dead on September 11th, 1988 on Western Avenue in South Los Angeles. She suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. Her body was nude and she was covered with a mattress. police were able to speak to a couple of neighbors who did see her get into an orange hatchback, which Pintos were hatchbacks. So this is the second witness to report seeing a victim getting into an orange-colored car. Alicia's dad did speak openly about police showing little to no interest when it came to investigating his daughter's murder. He didn't believe that she was a sex worker, but he did acknowledge that she did struggle with drug addiction. So he was being forthcoming about that. Now, by this time, the LAPD were able to link at least 7 of these murders based on ballistics examination of the bullets recovered from the victims' bodies, which showed they had all come from the same small caliber, 25 caliber handgun. Each victim was shot from left to right, front to back in a downward trajectory, which would be consistent with being shot while seated in the passenger seat of a car, the driver being the one doing the shooting. Now, at this time, DNA was really, really in its infancy. DNA was successfully swabbed off of most, if not all, of the victims. I believe he left saliva on their breasts, and investigators were able to match the genetic profiles and determine that it was all left by the same person, but they didn't know who. They didn't have a DNA database yet to make any matches. But they're still not reporting to the media that there was a potential serial killer in South Los Angeles. Now, I did see a report in their defense that this was a controversial decision to not go to the media about the serial killer because the LAPD said they did not want to alert the serial killer himself that they were onto him out of fear that he might go into hiding or leave the area. But of course, that leaves him wide open to continue killing with impunity because he thinks he's getting away with it, which seems to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, he was, in either way is not a good decision. But I would rather inform the public than not myself.
Right. I don't know. I don't know if he thought the cops knew or didn't know or didn't. I think maybe he thought they didn't care because of the victims that he was choosing.
Yeah, possibly. I think he had confirmed, I mean, for lots of reasons. I don't think that they really did. Yeah. And I think that once you get away with it 1 or 2 times, you start, like with anything, you start to think like, I'm invincible here. Right.
Okay, so now we get to the survivor. So on the evening of Sunday, November 20th, 1985, in the Westmont neighborhood of Los Angeles, the grim sleeper went out for victim number 9, but she ended up becoming his only known survivor. She was 29-year-old mother of 2, Anitria Washington. She was walking along Normandy Avenue, and as she passed by a neighborhood store, she was offered a ride to her friend's house by a black man who appeared to be in his 30s, driving an orange Ford Pinto with red racing stripes. And he asked her where she was headed, and she said she was going to a party. And he asked if he could go too, and she's like, sure. Of course, she had no idea that this guy had already killed 7 women, at least, when she accepted this ride. And because she had given him like a cursory once-over and decided that there wasn't anything threatening about him. As a matter of fact, she described him as kind of nerdy. And I guess she didn't feel there was anything about him that was indicative of him being a cold-blooded serial killer, because obviously if she thought that, she wouldn't have got in the car with him. So he first told Anitra that he needed to make a stop at his uncle's house to pick up some money, which he did. He drove to this house. It was located on 81st Street, and he went inside for about a minute or so. And when he came back, she noticed that his demeanor had shifted, and he had become kind of quiet. And so much so that it was unsettling to her, but before she could do anything, he pulled out a handgun and shot her one time in the middle of the chest. She began begging for him to not kill her. She was crying and she's freaking out, and he told her to shut her mouth or he'd shoot her again. And he next began pummeling Anitria, beating her about the head, and all the while she's slipping in and out of consciousness. During the course of this, he starts sexually assaulting her. And not only that, he grabbed a Polaroid camera and took a picture of her. And did you see the picture of her?
Yeah. She was a mess.
She's kind of slumped over to the right a little bit. She looks unconscious, and there's blood coming from her chest. And after he took the picture, he began beating her up again. And after a while, he started driving, And according to Anitria herself, she eventually tried to make a break for it, sort of. She opened the passenger door and fell out into the street. And then her attacker drove off, probably thinking he's leaving her for dead. But she did make it. She survived. She got herself to her feet and realized that she was pretty close to her friend's house, and she stumbled onto the front porch. She knocked, but nobody was home, so she collapsed right there and was finally discovered by her friend, who came home about 1 a.m, and miraculously her life was saved. So now the LAPD have a survivor, someone who could potentially identify her attacker, another person who puts him in an orange Pinto, a person who could have been shown a lineup to see if she could pick him out, because the bullet that they pulled from her body, it matched all of their previous victims that we've discussed thus far up to this point. But they didn't do that. They continued to stay quiet, in spite of the fact that they knew they had a serial killer on their hands here. And the women in South Los Angeles, the women of color, continued to be unaware of the possible danger lurking in their community. They didn't even tell Anitria that she survived an attack by a serial killer, that the same gun was used to kill 7 other women. She was able to give them a composite sketch of the attacker, and I don't know if they went public with the composite or not. Did you see? I don't think they were.
I don't think they did. I don't think so. Because if ridiculous. You do that, you have to identify.
Yeah, what he's doing.
You know, if not a serial killer, at least an attempted murderer, and they kept it
within the department. Yeah.
Yep.
So they only passed his image and the description of the car throughout the police department. Anitra also told police that she believed she saw the flash of a camera, and so they now know that if they find this guy, then he actually has photographic proof of his victims, and that this guy is taking pictures of everyone he's attacking, and those pictures will come back some years later. Now, once she was released from the hospital, she was able to show police where the house was that her attacker had supposedly stopped to see his uncle for money. Police put the house under surveillance for about 30 days. They talked to the homeowner as well, and he didn't seem to know who they were talking about. I don't know. I saw later on that they watched the house for 30 days and nothing happened. But we can talk about that a little bit later on when they get into the investigation. But apparently they said they surveilled the home for a while to see if they saw an orange Pinto or anyone matching their composite, but nothing turned up. Then again, Anitria survived. So what's going to be the Grim Sleeper's reaction to having a survivor? He's probably going to lay low.
Yeah, I don't know if he knew how he would have known necessarily that she survived.
Because I'm thinking that there must have been some kind of report, like even if it was a small, like crime blog, or, police blotter in the paper, that he must have been following this in some way. He was working for the city of Los Angeles too at the time. I wondered that too. I wondered how much he was following the investigation into himself.
I mean, because I think a lot of times they try.
Yeah.
Both because, like I said, you want people to be admiring your work to a degree, and because you want to know how close people are to getting to you. So I have my theories on how dormant he actually went.
Right. There's theories that he didn't, but I'm thinking that it's not necessarily a coincidence that he supposedly went dormant right after he had a survivor.
Yeah, I can't know. Because I just don't know for sure that he knew she survived or how he would have known she survived.
Yeah, I don't know how he would have known either, especially if they weren't reporting these things. So, following Anitria's attack, it appears as though the Grim Sleeper went on a hiatus from killing between 1988 and 2002, which is how he was given the moniker the Grim Sleeper. There is a strong possibility, and it is widely believed, that he did not actually stop killing. That would And he would later be definitively tied to at least 6 more killings aside from the ones that I've just listed here. And because that evidence would later be found, there was going to be evidence found amongst his belongings. It's almost certain that he may be responsible for as many as 24 killings. What did you read about his supposed hiatus?
I mean, so there's 2 ways of looking at serial killing, and the one is that they can't stop until they are imprisoned or dead. And in many ways, I would think that that applies here, that it becomes such a draw and a compulsion. And this guy, he looked so nondescript and flew under the radar so well that I wouldn't be surprised at all if he was able to continue doing what he was doing. He worked as, am I right that he worked as a bus driver?
Garbage man. He may have been a bus driver at some point, but it seemed as though he was a garbage man for about 9 years and then went on disability.
And so, you know, the whole garbage man taking out the trash, that concept,
yeah,
you know, that goes right along with. But what that is a job that gives him a lot of mobility.
Mm-hmm.
You know, either he's on the job or, yeah, exactly. So he knows the area well, and he can easily enough broaden his route or go along his route in a way. You learn the town well, and you also you have an excuse to be out in a truck. And so if you, I don't know how, like, there's just so many options. There's so many ways, like, where he could have done an extra route and picked somebody up and killed her and thrown her in the back of the truck. Easy. Nobody ever finds it. You know, that kind of concept where I don't think he could have gone dormant because compulsions are so intensely strong. You know, serial killing can be likened to having OCD. And when you have OCD, it's an anxiety disorder where you really feel like incredibly horrible things, including death, are going to happen if you don't do these specific things. Like if you don't check the stove 3 times every night before you go to bed, then your house is going to burn down and you're all going to die, you know, or that sort of concept. And serial killing can be likened to that feeling of like just this buildup of like an anxiety, like a physical compulsion. Like you need to do a thing, and that's the only way you will feel their version of better. Right. And if that's the case, then he wouldn't stop. You can't. Like you're driven by these needs in your body, and so he may have just simply gotten smarter. You know, he may have just simply altered some aspect of his technique in order to be able to do what he wanted to do, but flying farther under the radar. So that's one possibility for me. The other way that you can look at serial killers is like an addiction. Like the first time you do it, you get a high. And here's a guy who is known for at least one sexual assault in the 70s. So he's drawn toward that kind of behavior in the first place. And then it just gets bigger and bigger until, you know, he's killing people, and he's killing at a pretty high rate. And, you know, one every 3 months or so. That's pretty fast to suddenly go dormant. But the thing is, like with an addiction, with any addiction, you can stop. You know, you can effectively go into rehab, as it were. For serial killing, like you can find some reason to stop. You can move into a new neighborhood, you can have a child, you can get married, you can be in prison. Like there's a lot of reasons why you may stop for a while, either because of internal desire to stop or because of external forces that make you stop. And like if you have a profound addiction to alcohol or to heroin or whatever, you can get it under control and stop using for a long time and maintain that sort of sobriety for a long time. And then something happens to either bring your drug of choice into you, like somebody brings alcohol to your house and you're like, okay, well, fine, I've been sober for 14 years. It's okay, I'm going to drink this one time. Or you can be so stressed out that you go seek it out, right? Like something happens, a big blowout argument or something, and you're like, you know what, screw everything, I'm going to the bar, and go out that way. And so either way with this guy, he could have been out driving in a new car and offered somebody a ride and just suddenly found himself sort of falling back into old habits, or he could have had some sort of argument at home that led him, like, you know, I'm just going to go drive until somebody gets in my car, like, whatever, you know. And so either way is possible. I don't buy into the addiction viewpoint as much for serial killing as I don't tend to buy into addiction as a good model for any behavioral problem. I don't buy into sex addiction. I don't buy into gambling addiction as being physiological addictions the way heroin is. Like, I think that they are really intense behavioral repetitions kind of thing, but I don't think that they should be treated or viewed with the same language as a physiological addiction, because I don't think the treatment is as effective if you treat them the same. So I don't think that was the case. I think this guy kept killing all along, and he just got away with it, both because he figured out some refinement of technique not to get caught, and because the police weren't looking.
Well, I mean, okay, back to the addiction thing. Like, I don't want to say gambling, but as far as like killing somebody, if a serial killer is getting some sort of sexual arousal out of this, wouldn't that be something physiological? No. A feeling that you'd want to keep.
Well, you'd want to keep. So like the reason they use the phraseology and the framework of addiction is that, so for any drug or any activity, they call it an addiction because you're feeling crappy in some way. What you're feeling stressed, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling depressed, whatever it might be, and you do a thing that makes you feel better. You find some way of, you know, the first time you use heroin, suddenly all of your pain goes away, and you're like, oh my God, that's what I need. And then for the rest of the time that you're using, it's not exactly so much. Like, the heroin high is part of the issue, but the addiction part is that the first time you used, you had a bigger than expected response. Like, you might have used in hopes that the pain would go away, but it went away so big and so hard and so much better than you thought it was going to, that now you're not just chasing a high, you're chasing that first high. Right? That's what addiction is. It's different. You know, physiological dependency is the extra level that makes drug addiction fundamentally different than like sex addiction or gambling addiction. And so it's just, that part is the same. That idea of, I'm feeling wrong, bad, empty, something, and I go out and I offend against another human being, and suddenly I feel alive. I feel amped up. I feel something. And I'm going to do it again. And a lot of times you see the violence increase over time because it doesn't work the second time as well as it did the first. Because the second time you kind of anticipate that high and you expect it to be a certain way, and then it's not that same certain way, and you're let down and you're frustrated. Right? But there's not a physiological addiction dependency idea. And that's where the drug addiction and behavioral addiction separate from me. And that's why I wish they had different words for them.
Right. Speaking of taking a break from serial killing, we know that the Golden State Killer, James Joseph DeAngelo, famously took a 5-year break between 1981 and 1986. But his attack in 1986 would end up being his last. He had been breaking into homes and raping and killing and robbing and doing all sorts of stuff for about 5 years or so, right? And according to the lead investigator on the case, Paul Holes, DeAngelo suddenly stopped in 1981 on his attack on Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez. And he thinks, Holes's theory is that Gregory Sanchez put up such a vicious fight against DeAngelo, who was by this time in his mid-40s. So he opined that because he had difficulty with Sanchez, that it kind of scared DeAngelo into this quote-unquote retirement, so to speak. But then he came back 5 years later and raped and killed 19-year-old Janelle Cruz down here in Irvine, California. And Holes has said that DeAngelo was unable to control himself, but that was the end of it. After that, he was, you know, into his 50s, and he ended his criminal career completely. did you think that that's something that just happened because of age?
Well, there's a case of like that external reason to stop, right? That Sanchez fought back and he was left effectively sort of, that's like an intervention, right? That idea of somebody externally sort of makes you stop, that would fit. And you're left frustrated. And then finally you have a relapse, but the relapse is not as good. Because, first of all, you're not getting your first high again. But secondly, you're scared the whole damn time. Because you're afraid you're going to get caught. You're afraid you're going to get sick. Whatever that fear is, it's not as good. And you're frustrated. And finally you're like, you know what? Fine. I'm going to go into sort of a sobriety. And I think that the same could be applied to, if you look at it as a compulsion, you're compelled to do things in a certain way. And, if you're not somebody who likes physical confrontation, which D'Angelo did not like physical confrontation. He wanted everybody to lie down and be still and be quiet while I do my thing. And I'm going to use strangulation or a gun, as a threatening device. And I want everybody to quiet, and I want to take control, and I want to be in charge here and just subdue everybody. And then when he can't subdue people, that shakes him, because that's totally outside of his fantasy. Right. This is not how it's supposed to be.
Okay, well, at this point, he's supposedly on this hiatus. Probably not, but no more killings were being attributed to this serial killer who they were calling back then the South Side Slayer. He hadn't yet gotten the name the Grim Sleeper, but I want to just call him that just to keep it consistent. Mm-hmm. So in 2001, they with new DNA technology, the LAPD chief at the time, Bernard Parks, he set aside some detectives in his department to review some cold cases. And what ended up happening was they were linking several of the cases above with DNA. And I'm going to talk more about that investigation into the DNA in a moment, but I want to finish up the victims because there's more. Because he seemed to have suddenly resurfaced in 2002. On Tuesday, March 19th, the 9th victim attributed to the Grim Sleeper was discovered. She was the only one who was not an adult. She was 15-year-old Princess Bartholomew, and she was discovered without any clothing on. She was beaten and strangled and found in an alleyway behind some bushes in the city of Inglewood. She was last seen by her family on December 21st, 2001, and I believe that she was considered to be a runaway who had been in and out of foster care.
She had the worst life. Her life was so hard. Right.
And her death would mark the commencement of the so-called second phase of the Grim Reaper's, I almost said Green River.
Right.
Grim Reaper's killings. By this time, he would be approaching his 50th birthday, but it would take some time for investigators on her case to connect her to the killings in the 80s, but they will eventually. The 10th victim attributed to the Grim Reaper was 35-year-old Valerie McCorvey. She was discovered Friday, July 11th, 2003 by a crossing guard in the Westmont area of Los Angeles. She was on the street, not in an alleyway like the previous victims. And like Princess, she was strangled to death, and her own sweater had been draped over her head. She was known to have struggled with drug addiction, but her aunt had reported that just a few months prior to her death that she had contacted her and she left her a message telling her that she was okay. So about 2 years after Valerie's death, on May 31st, 2005, the LAPD finally discovered a DNA match between Valerie's case, that of Princess Bartholomew's 2002 death, and a DNA sample that had been preserved from Mary Lowe's 1987 death. So we can imagine that the police are pretty shocked that they've tied two recent killings to one from almost 14 years earlier. And remember, Mary's killing was linked to all the other women through ballistics matches. So no other murder cases have been linked back to the initial series of killings in the in-between years, though it's largely believed that he really didn't stop, and the killings that may have been likely, any killings that he may have likely committed between 88 and 2002 just simply weren't connected. So between the DNA and all of the ballistics information connecting all of these women, they've been able to positively attribute 9 murders and 1 attempted murder to one man at this point. So these two killings of Princess and Valerie by way of strangulation, why do you think he made this major change?
He may have been fantasizing about that all along. You know, a couple of his earlier victims had signs of that. And, I mean, I don't like thinking in this way, but frankly, it's less messy. And if you want to get them onto the point of death, but not quite dead, when you have sex with them, you know, better, in air quotes, to strangle them than to shoot them, because then your clothes are not messed up, you know, and you don't have to worry about having the right aim so that you don't kill them too quickly. And just generally, it feels like more of a power move, more of a, you know, as a lot of men get older, their sense of masculinity and virility start to fade. And so being able to kill somebody with your bare hands feels more, you know, toxic masculinity, right? That idea feels more manly and strong and vicious. Like, I always have my killing weapon on me than to shoot somebody. And so he may have been compensating.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I hadn't really thought too deeply into it because I wasn't really sure. I thought maybe he was trying to just do things differently to not be connected. And like you said, also to not make such a big mess, because investigations have definitely changed and trace evidence was more of a thing, you know?
Yeah, he may well have been trying to cut down on evidence, but I think that kind of like anything, if you picture, I mean, those of us who have been married a long time tend to get into certain routines with sex after a while. And you have to sort of consciously decide if you're going to switch things up or not, because once you get into a routine and then you're in the moment, you don't tend to be like, wait, stop. I want to try something totally new now, or I want to totally evolve my technique, because you know it works, right? And so if this guy's doing this to get off, then it's the same kind of like, you stick with what works, especially when you're with a stranger and you don't, you know, this is not somebody where you can be like, wait, let's talk about this and decide exactly how we're going to try to change things, you know? And so it feels to me like I don't give most crimes that are not of like a financial white collar type crime, you know, most crimes of passion, whether they be like domestic violence types crimes or in the moment, or even if they're a serial killing, murder, like intentional murder, those, there comes a moment where you tip over from being like, I'm thinking about doing a thing to I'm doing the thing. And you don't really have the mental capacity, I guess, to be like, okay, slow down, wait, I'm worried about getting caught.
Right. Okay, so it was sometime in 2006 when reporters at LA Weekly began hearing murmurings coming from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office that they were researching and cross-referencing quote-unquote body dumps. One reporter began poking around and learned that there was a DNA match between Princess, killed in 2002, Valerie, killed in 2003, and Mary Lowe, killed in 1987, and this really piqued their interest. This was a big deal because it was a huge span of time for a killer. This reporter, she literally became all consumed with these unsolved murders, and her name was Christine Pelisek. And if you look up her articles, she wrote extensively for this case for LA Weekly, and she basically broke the case to the media. Mind you, before, the LAPD has never said anything publicly, and she is also credited with giving the unknown killer the name the Grim Sleeper. The LAPD, during their investigation into the cases, were referring to him as a Southside Slayer, but like I said, those names, that name never made it onto headlines or into the news at night, the local news. Now, Kate and I were first going to discuss Richard Ramirez, and we decided, when we were deciding on which California serial killer to cover, we had settled on that for a long time, but literally at the last minute, I asked Kate if we could switch to the Grim Sleeper, because I didn't think he was as covered as extensively as Richard Ramirez was, and she agreed because, you know, she's talented and cool like that and can pretty much talk about anything on the fly. But I wanted to mention that he was killing at the same time that the summer that the Grim Sleeper got started. As a matter of fact, if you line up the cases of these two men, you can put the Grim Sleeper right smack in the middle of it all. Because Richard Ramirez, he is believed to have killed one person in 1984 and started killing in early 85. And that's when his spree started. He started sexually assaulting some children in February and March of 85. In March, he killed a 34-year-old named Dale Okazaki. And that same day, he killed Tsai Lian Yu and pulled her out of her car and took her car. On March 20th, he kidnapped and sexually assaulted another young child. On the 27th, he beat 64-year-old Vincent Zazara to death and stabbed his wife. I believe she survived. On May 14th, he shot and killed 65-year-old William Doy and sexually assaulted his wife. On May 29th, he beat 84-year-old Mabel Bell and her 81-year-old sister, Florence Lang, both of them to death. One of them survived for about a month and a half or so. June 27th, he killed 32-year-old Patty Higgins. July 2nd, he murdered 77-year-old Mary Cannon. July 7th, he murdered 61-year-old Joyce Nelson. And July 20th, he murdered 32-year-old Chairong Kovaneth and beat up his wife and son. And it was around this time that the community he was all over the news. I don't know if you heard about the Night Stalker where you were living, but I was 10 years old at the time, and I was deathly afraid every single night because every night on the news, it was the Night Stalker, the Night Stalker, the Night Stalker. So we knew about him. August 8th, he killed 35-year-old Elias Abawath. And it was on that day, on August 8th, that the Los Angeles County Sheriff revealed publicly for the first time that a serial killer was loose in Southern California. Within 2 days of that announcement, emergency calls jumped 15% and gun sales spiked. And it was that weekend, 2 days later, on Saturday, August 10th, 1985, that the man who would later become known as the Grim Sleeper committed his first known killing. And he would not kill another person till a year later. So, you know, from there that Ramirez continued on his crime spree. He even headed to San Francisco, and the mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein, famously announced to the media the style and size of shoe that the killer wore and the type of weapon that he was using. And when that happened, law enforcement from LA to San Francisco collectively cringed, knowing that the killer himself was just tipped off to the information that they had on him. And I believe in response to this, Ramirez threw his shoes off the Golden Gate Bridge, but I don't think he tossed away his gun. So it is early on in the Grim Sleeper's crimes, but it's likely learning from what happened in the media with the Night Stalker that the LAPD didn't want to have the same things happening with their investigation. And so that's sort of how they excused away, because there was such a frenzy about the Night Stalker. Do you remember hearing about him in 85?
No. You know, I was just a little bit younger. I was 8, and I lived in New York State. So,
right. So,
you know, there was enough of
big news there.
No, it might have been on the news, but I wasn't clued into the news in the same way.
Yeah.
I think that
I was so afraid. And I wanted to know what you thought about that. Like, do you think that the Night Stalker and the media response to him had an impact on how they were going to handle the Grim Sleeper in the years to come following that?
You know, I'm of two minds on it, because on the one hand, I can totally see like that cop mindset, which has eased back considerably now. But that idea of we don't share information, we don't cross jurisdictions among police, much less with the media. Like there's this need for total control over all evidence at all time, which is complete crap. Like, it's complete bullshit. And I just because what happened with the Night Stalker? How was he caught? He was caught by vigilantes on the street.
Right.
He was caught by people who recognized descriptions of this guy and recognized he was behaving weird and had seen, you know, a composite sketch of him on TV and literally chased him down in the street and started beating the crap out of him until police showed up. So, you know, releasing to the public, on the one hand, tips off the killer, okay, but it also tips off thousands of, citizen deputy type roles, other people who can, because one of the sort of definitions of legal competency to stand trial, for instance, is, would you do what you did in front of a cop? Right? And a lot of us, in the presence of a uniform, behave differently. Like, I slow down if I see a cop sitting on the side of the road, like, even if I'm not speeding. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I speed all the time. Let me just put that out there. So even if I slow down, that's a noteworthy thing. But so in the presence of authority, we behave differently than we do even in the presence of like neighbors or onlookers on the street. Like if I'm doing something bad on the street, if I'm prone to, I don't know, hitting my kids, for instance, which I'm not, but if I was prone to that, I would stop in front of a cop. Right. But I wouldn't necessarily stop in front of a neighbor. I might just glare at a neighbor and be like, mind your own damn business and keep doing what I'm doing. Like if I'm of that sort of criminal mindset. And so by putting out information about Ramirez, sure, it tipped off Ramirez, but it also tipped off a whole lot more other people.
Right.
Right. And that's how he was caught. So letting go of that control over the investigation, like realizing that you're not catching the guy with standard operating procedure. You got to change it up. Mm-hmm. And so I'm all for releasing information, even though I understand why they didn't. And I definitely believe okay, so for one thing, there can't have been that many orange Pintos. Like there just cannot. And so police have access to the DMV records, right? Mm-hmm. And to run that down. But then as a secondary level, you have that and then you put it out to the public. Like, have you seen anybody who seems like he just goes out for these aimless drives, or he goes out for a pack of cigarettes, but he's gone for like an hour? Like, have you seen anybody do this with his orange Pinto? You're going to get phone calls.
Yeah, I know.
And
it's frustrating to think about.
It's insane. And I don't know how many people, so I'm frustrated both because I don't know how many of these women would have survived, including unnamed women, because they figured out they substantiated 6 more beyond the 10 that he was convicted for, 6 more killings. And I believe some of those were in that 14-year span.
Yes.
Which sort of inherently proves that he did not go dormant. But so it would have saved some of those lives for sure.
And by the way, he was not convicted. The families collectively agreed, in order to get this process moving along, that they would not be prosecuting for their deaths, because they just would have to go back and it would be so much time would be consumed, and it would only prolong the process of getting this guy convicted and put away.
For the other 6, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the prosecutor went to the families and was like, we're not going to add that. Are you okay with this? And they were like, yeah, just get him in jail.
Right. Well, and they like to reserve aside some cases just in case the main one goes wrong. So they prosecuted him for 9 murders and 1 attempted murder all at the same time.
Yeah, up to 10.
10 murders and 1 attempted?
I have one more murder to talk about.
Oh, okay. But they said it, they want to say, like, we're going to reserve some extras so that if something goes terribly wrong with that case, we can prosecute him again without double jeopardy. Right. So that was also part of it. But yeah, so some of those people would have survived, and that's inherently important to me. But also, other serial killers are watching the news, right? And other criminals, one-off criminals, are watching the news. And if they're seeing that not a whole lot of murders are being reported, especially murders of disenfranchised people of color, perceived sex workers, perceived drug users, just they don't go notice, you start to think, like, I can get away with that too.
Yeah, right.
So by not publicizing, like, this is a problem, this is what's going on, people start to feel like, well, they're not noticing, I can do the same thing too. So it's dangerous both in terms of subsequent actual victims of this guy and potential victims of other people.
Right. So the final victim in the second phase of the Grim Sleeper's killing was 25-year-old Denicia Peters. She was discovered dead by a homeless person looking for recyclables on January 1st, 2007, in Los Angeles. She was naked, and she had suffered a gunshot wound to the back this time, and she was placed inside a garbage bag. So with this killing, he went back to using a gun, but she wasn't shot the same way. She wasn't shot in the chest. She was shot in the back. The gun that was used in the initial series of killings, I believe, wasn't ever actually found, but they would find the gun in this killing. So I'll get to that when we get to the search of his house. DNA testing recovered from her killing linked her to the others. And there was also DNA on the zip tie that was used to seal the trash bag, and there was also saliva left on her body. Now, this is the case where the Grim Sleeper finally came to the forefront of the LAPD's priorities. They snapped into action. They knew that they had a serious problem, and the victim list had grown too many years now. But they didn't come forward on their own. They came forward because LA Weekly broke the news about the serial killer from the 80s having resurfaced in the 2000s. And they called the police out on being hush-hush about it. And it wasn't the police that told the families and the victims. It wasn't the police that told the survivor in Etria, Washington. And it wasn't the police that told the public at large. It was LA Weekly magazine. And the LAPD's hand was finally forced to speak up about it. I don't know if they ever would have, So following Genesia's killing, the police chief at the time, William Bratton, ordered a formation of a task force along with an 800 number tip line headquartered at LAPD's Parker Center to investigate what he now believed to be a serial killer whose killings had spanned more than 2 decades. In August of 2008, a website was set up that contained all the information that they had on the Grim Sleeper. 2 months later, the LAPD announced an unprecedented $500,000 reward that was voted on by the Los Angeles City Council for information leading to the capture of the Grim Sleeper. Cold case investigators looked at as many as 30 unsolved murders to see if any more DNA could be linked to the DNA profile of the Grim Sleeper. On November 1st, 2008, he was featured on America's Most Wanted. And in December of 2008, a familial DNA search in an attempt to link anyone in the criminal database failed to find a match to the Grim Sleeper. And I'll talk more about familial DNA in a moment. It would not be until February 25th of 2009 that the LAPD chief finally addressed the media for the first time on behalf of the department regarding the serial killer, which he officially labeled as the Grim Sleeper. The LAPD would not, I don't believe that they would have gone public if it weren't for the reporting and the journalism that was being done, the journalistic work that was being done for LA Weekly. During his press conference, the chief also released the 911 call that described the blue and white Dodge van along with the license plate number from that witness who had seen victim number 4, Barbara Ware, being left behind. When the story broke in LAPD, South Los Angeles, its community was incensed. And it was because of this outrage that the LAPD stopped dragging its feet on this case and pushed them to do the DNA testing, which we'll get into. So, as far as the investigation into the Grim Sleeper, because we've kind of alluded to the fact that if you go down the list of victims, this case was mishandled. These women were overlooked, undoubtedly because they were women of color, because they were thought to be sex workers, which whether they were or whether they weren't is irrelevant. They were runaways or they were drug addicts, again, irrelevant. But it's probably not surprising to anyone listening that the case was not being taken seriously. And it's been revealed in the years since that police more likely than not had the idea that they had the serial killer on their hands. He was actively killing on their watch. They had some good information that could have been followed up on. There was a clear pattern when it came to these killings. They were all young black women, sexually assaulted, shot in the chest, left in alleys or in trash bins, covered up with garbage, and ballistic matches were made. Bullets recovered from the victims, including the one survivor, who knew what this man looked like. But They never even gave her a lineup. They never had her look at any suspects or anything. So,
I mean, I can, like, for one, like I said, the concept of what a serial killer was squishy back then. And I think a lot of times people believed you had to do something really big and weird in order to be a serial killer. Like, the serial killers couldn't do just shoot them and throw them out. Like, there had to be wicked acts of sexual perversion or weird ritualistic behaviors of some sort. Otherwise, they just couldn't be a serial killer. Like, in their minds, I mean, it was sort of the idea of you can't have sex unless it's a fetish.
right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, that's what it seemed like. So for one, they tended to overlook stuff like this. For another, there was tremendous gang violence, and so finding a young black human shot and left for dead in an alley was sadly common. I mean, this is South Central. That's what this was.
Yeah, that's what they were saying.
You know, it was South Central LA, which they renamed in 2003 to South LA to get rid of some of that stigma, which, you know, for me is hilarious because I live in Salem, Massachusetts, which the real Salem, where all the witch stuff happened, is 2 towns away, right? And it's called Danvers now, and they renamed it because they were so appalled
Right.
by what had happened. And so I'm like, we just keep doing this. Like, history just keeps repeating itself, you know?
Right.
And so this idea of, like, I'm going to change the name of the town and nobody's going to know what happened. Right. Okay. But so
I call it South LA now because I'm one that doesn't want to have that stigma hanging over the city anymore either. The department did say that those were different times and the LAPD was not prepared for the high rates of violent crime that was plaguing the city back then. And basically that these women slipped through the cracks amidst all the other murders, mostly gang and drug related, that were going on at the same time.
Well, and plus they thought that there was a serial killer, but they were lumping several, what they now think somewhere between 4 and 7 active serial killers in South LA at the time.
Right. Some would even go so far as to say that 1980s Los Angeles was the perfect time to be a serial killer. It was an era in the city's history where crime was at an all-time high. So whether a killing was gang-related or serial killer-related, it mostly fell under the umbrella of random street crime. And I don't know if I buy into that excuse because these women were being sexually assaulted. If you're a gang member and you're killing a rival gang member, they're not going to be sexually assaulted. And, you know, so there was a pattern that could have been followed in these killings, but whatever. I wanted to get into familial DNA next.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, but there's just a case of, like, from the lens of 2019, it's easy to look at this and be like, let me tell you all the ways they screwed up.
Yeah.
And there were plenty. You know, just I have such a problem inherently with, and I can't remember the name of the researcher who came up with the term, but the term is the less dead. And that means that there's these people who kind of live on the fringes of society. They don't live, you know, a perfectly clean white bread existence. You know, that they might occasionally indulge in drug use if they have to get through a night. They may occasionally engage in sex work because they need to eat. But for the most part, they just have a regular job, or they, you know, they kind of float from job to job and they kind of put their lives together, but they live like unremarkable lives, right? Mm-hmm. Or they are sex workers, or they are runaways, or they are addicted to, you know, IV drugs or whatever, street drugs. In all of those people are considered less dead in the sense that when they die, they leave family behind that feels like it doesn't have the resources to press for a good investigation or to raise media awareness or whatever. And so the family is just sort of left to say, well, that sucks, and move on because they feel powerless, because they are powerless. Or they've already been living on the streets alone and they leave no family at all that knows that they've just died.
Right.
And so they're the less dead. There's not as big of an impact in the moment when they die.
Right.
And so serial killers can prey on them and choose to prey on them most of the time because they're good profilers. I mean, they know who a good victim is. They may not want this particular person as their victim. They may want somebody else, but they choose this particular victim because they know they're going to get away with this one better than the other one.
Right. So by the time the Grim Sleeper had killed this 10th woman, the DNA database of felony offenders had been established in California, probably nationwide too, but I don't know at what point they all collectively went into one national database. So if anybody committed a felony in California, their DNA was entered into the database so it could be cross-referenced with DNA from past crimes. And of course, anything that were going to come up in the future. The DNA profile that was developed from these series of killings did not match any DNA in the database when it was initially entered. Now, the proposition that passed for DNA swabs to be taken from every felony arrest didn't happen until 2004. The Grim Sleeper did have some felonies going on in his background, but his last arrest happened in 2003, so he just missed the DNA collecting by about a year. And I'll talk about his criminal history a little bit later on, too. But a thing was happening when it came to DNA technology as we were getting closer to 2010. A groundbreaking DNA test technique was developed that would be able to identify any DNA profile to any member of their family found in the DNA database. So they again tried over the 4th of July holiday of 2010. They ran the DNA from the Grim Sleeper case through the system, and once that technique was applied to the Grim Sleeper's DNA profile and it was processed through the database, they got a hit. And his name was Chris Franklin. Now, Chris Franklin had been convicted of a felony weapons charge. As a result of that, he was compelled to provide a DNA sample to be entered into the database. When he popped up as a 99% match as a relative of the Grim Sleeper, they surreptitiously tracked him down to see where he was living and what relatives were around, because it was clear that Chris Franklin was far too young to be the Grim Sleeper himself. So they found him. He was back home with his mom and his dad at a house in South Los Angeles, and his dad's name was Lonnie Franklin Jr. And what do you know? He's a former City of Los Angeles employee with the Department of Public Works Bureau of Sanitation, a.k.a. he's a garbage man. So, who is Lonnie Franklin? By all accounts, he was a really well-known and well-liked guy in the community. He was born and raised in South Los Angeles. He was married by the time that he came up in the Grim Sleeper investigation for more than 30 years. His wife was a devout, God-fearing woman named Sylvia. They had 2 children together and a couple of grandkids. Prior to being suspected of being the Grim Sleeper, Lonnie Franklin did have somewhat of an extensive criminal history. You mentioned earlier that he did have a rape conviction in the 70s. Did you research into that?
Yeah, that was gross, and I hate it.
Did you read that it was a gang rape?
Yeah, it was 3 men. This is in Germany, and he was in the service. 3 men kidnapped I want to say 15-year-old. I don't remember her age.
I don't recall her age either.
But I mean, young. They took her, off base, and they all 3 of them raped her.
Right.
And all 3 of them were convicted for about 3 years. 17-year-old girl. All 3 of them were convicted for this charge, so they were caught. They got 3-year sentences for rape. He served less than a year, although the other 2 men served their full sentences, and it's unclear why, like what the difference was between them. But he was given a general discharge from the military,
not a dishonorable discharge.
Exactly. Yeah. And he just went on with his life from there.
Yeah. After he was given this general discharge, it was like nothing happened. He came back to Los Angeles in July of 1975. He had a few more things going on in his criminal background even before the rape conviction in Germany. Going back to as early as 1969, he had racked up a total of 15 felony convictions ranging from grand theft auto, assault and battery, and being in possession of stolen property. As I mentioned earlier, he did work as a garbage man for the City of Los Angeles. He's often described as retired, but in 2010, when he was identified as the Grim Sleeper, he was actually collecting disability to the tune of $1,700 a month. The nature of this disability is not clear. So Lonnie Franklin's arrest through familial DNA identification was a landmark case here in California, probably across the United States. The familial DNA program was enacted in 2008 by then Governor Jerry Brown, and California was the first state to utilize the new technique and technology. At the time, it was unprecedented and controversial, but Governor Brown said that sometimes it's necessary. It's a necessary tool to bring dangerous killers to justice. And I do believe that Lonnie Franklin is the first person to be identified through familial DNA match. And, you know, a year and a half ago, the Golden State Killer was identified as using similar techniques, but his relative was found in an ancestry DNA database. Franklin's was found in the felony offenders database, which is a little bit different, same concept. I don't know how much controversy was raised in regards to Franklin's identification, but those issues definitely were raised in the wake of the identification of Joseph James DeAngelo. Because, you know, police going in and snooping around on public DNA databases isn't a thing that people really care for. So, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, yeah, it wasn't public. That's my bottom line. And it's comparable to people get upset over being censored on Facebook, and they forget, like they like to want to say whatever it is that they want to say, and then they get upset about freedom of speech. And the answer is you don't have freedom of speech on Facebook, because Facebook is a private enterprise, right? You have freedom of speech if you want to stand in your front yard, but not on a privately owned social media site. And likewise, you know, the familial DNA use within a situation such as Franklin's is a little squishy for me, a little iffy, and I'll come back to that in a second. But for DeAngelo, his relative voluntarily submitted to a private DNA database. And I'm sure if they didn't then, they certainly now have clauses that you know, everybody just clicks OK, send. You know, they don't really think about it. But that there's a clause that says, yeah, you can use my DNA for purposes other than simply matching me with other relatives. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what they mean. And now it's more explicit. Like, you know, we're going to do this, right? Like, you know, this is the thing, right?
I think now I think you're automatically opted out. And in order for your DNA to be available for analysis by law enforcement and agencies and whatnot, you have to purposely opt in.
I think that depends on this places. I think that may be the default right now, but it's not a law. Because they are privately owned. And so I think the consensus among the private ancestry match kind of places right now is that they want people to voluntarily opt in, but they don't have to. But they are all private entities, and they have every right to just send everything over to the cops at will because they're private entities. So I actually don't have any problem at all with DeAngelo's situation, because the relative voluntarily submitted the thing, and he voluntarily committed the crimes, and so everything gets together there. I'm not conflicted exactly, but just a little more hesitant in where I tread when I look at Franklin's situation, because his son was convicted of a felony, and his DNA was entered as a way, you know, compulsory. He didn't give it voluntarily. And that was a way to try and match whether his son had committed any other crimes. Like, that's the theory on...
Not necessarily his family members.
Exactly. And because he didn't give that sample voluntarily, it becomes iffy on whether you can compare his DNA to his family's or whatever. But on the flip side, it's not like they then just swooped in and arrested Lonnie Franklin. You know, they did their due diligence to follow Chris home and see who he lived with, see he had a father, and then they chose to surreptitiously collect his DNA, which I love. And, you know, I just love when they do that.
That's up next in what I wanted to talk about.
You know, but so that, like, all of that, like, I'm okay with it through legal means and also through moral means. Like, I'm okay with the process. Like, if they had skipped the steps and gone straight from, we found that you're related to somebody, and hey, look, you have a father in the right age range, so we're just going to arrest your father, I would have a problem with that.
Right.
You know, but I feel like morally, like, I guess I feel like we live in an age where we give up certain rights in order to protect the greater good.
Right. So, once it was determined that Lonnie Franklin could possibly be the Grim Sleeper, detectives began tailing him around the clock. And it took 3 days for him to even begin to leave his house. It was Monday, July 5th of 2010. When he finally left, they tracked him all the way into Orange County to the city of Buena Park. And I've talked about Buena Park in a previous episode when I covered the murder of Jasmine Fiore. And oddly enough, if you recall, she was murdered by her husband and left in a trash bin there. Mm-hmm. So Franklin went to Buena Park. He went to the mall. And in the mall, there's a place called John's Incredible Pizza. And if you aren't familiar, it's this big indoor family entertainment center with games. And I even think there are some rides in there, too. I can't exactly recall. It's been a long time since I've been there, but I was there once for a birthday party. And I mostly stayed in the party room while the kids played. But yeah, the one in the Buena Park Mall, that's the one he went to. And he was going to a birthday party that day. So he's sitting there and eating and talking with other attendees in the party room, and detectives are watching him. And they really aren't hiding because one of them actually dressed up as a John's Incredible Pizza employee and bussed the tables. And once Franklin had finished his meal and left, the detective gathered up numerous items he observed him using: utensils, his plate with the partially eaten piece of pizza, and a beverage tumbler, and some napkins. And once they had those items, they sent those off to the lab on the double, and the test results confirmed that Lonnie Franklin was indeed the Grim Sleeper, and he was taken into custody 2 days later, on July 7th, 2010, and subsequently charged with 1 count of attempted murder and 10 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, either using a gun or having multiple murders. Either way, those special circumstances made him eligible for the death penalty. And I love the way that he was caught, too.
It sounds like this place where he was caught is comparable to either a Chuck E. Cheese or like a laser tag kind of place.
It's like a Chuck E. Cheese on steroids.
Yeah, and either way, I look at that, it's like, I think of myself going there like this is insult to injury, right? Like, not only do I have to go to Chuck E. Cheese, but now I'm being arrested for multiple murder. Like, how fair?
I don't know what he was doing there. They didn't say if he went with his grandkid or whose kid it was.
Yeah, I think it was a grandkid's birthday. It was either a grandkid or a nephew.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how much I hate Chuck E. Cheese.
The cops, yeah, I mean, I had my kid, we did all the Chuck E. Cheese things, and John's Incredible Pizza was a little bit a step up from Chuck E. Cheese. I liked it. I was separated from all of the kids and noise. I was in the party room, so I was happy. And I had pizza and salad bar and whatever. So next up was the interrogation. Did you watch his interrogation?
No, I
watched the whole thing, and it was really, he's arrogant and he's disgusting, but he was interrogated the day that he was arrested. They asked him, "Do you know why you're arrested?" And he was really calm, and he's leaned back in his chair. He had his legs crossed, his hands in his lap, and he's like, "I have no idea." And they told him that their investigation brought about a warrant for his arrest for murder. And he was like, "Murder?" And they're like, "Yes, murder." And they read him his rights. And Franklin laughed. He was chuckling, and he came off as just a real asshole, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And he said he doesn't know what any of this is about, so yeah, let's talk. So they started off by telling him they were investigating a murder that occurred in 2007. They're working backwards. And they showed him a picture of a young lady. "Do you recognize her? This is Janicia Peters." Franklin, he kind of picked up the picture, slid it close to him. He never really took it off the table, glanced at it, and pushed it back towards the detective and said, "I don't know her." And they said, well, they've been investigating her case for 3 years, and they let him know that they just didn't pick him randomly to arrest, that if he watches crime shows on TV, that they have the technology now, and he's been identified as being connected to her. And why would they identify him? And Franklin said he has no idea. He knows a lot of people, but he doesn't know her. And the detective was like, "Well, your DNA was identified in relation to this young lady's death." And Franklin was like, "Okay." And the detective was like, "That's your response? Okay." And he was like, "Well, I'm just saying, you're telling me what you're telling me, that's all I can say. So he was just going to sit there, and it would just be denial after denial after denial. They brought up the 2003 murder of Valerie McCorvey, showed him a picture, denied he knowing her, told him he was linked through DNA. They next showed him a picture of Alicia Alexander from 1988, told him, they showed him Princess Bartholomew's picture, 2002, said his DNA would link him again. He said, I don't know her. Then they showed him Alicia Alexander's from 88, denied knowing her. Then they showed him Lucretia Jefferson's picture, denied knowing her. Then they pulled out Bernita Sparks from 87, denied knowing her. And then they went back to their pictures, and they showed him a picture of Barbara Ware. No, don't know her either. And at this point, the detective telling him, like, you're insulting my intelligence here. And he takes this pile of pictures and he spreads them all out in front of Lonnie Franklin. And he's like, look at these women. And he's like, all of their fingers are pointing at you. And then he pulls out a picture of Henrietta Wright. And not only did he deny knowing her, he called her butt ugly. And finally, they pulled out their last picture, his first victim, Deborah Jackson. And for the 10th time, another denial. And they told him that, do you know what they call you in the media? Do they know who they call the man in the media? You've heard of him. And the Lonnie Franklin said, the Reaper. And they told him, the Grim Sleeper. That's you. You're the Grim Sleeper. He's like, nope, that's not me. And he just continued to deny. And eventually he asked for an attorney. So he was really, really dismissive of these women. He insulted them, and he just never, I don't think to this day he's ever confessed to anything. So, I mean,
because that's part of what makes me think that there's more. And so for one thing, I think, okay, this is a terrible, terrible analogy, but it's funny to me. I have spent time in my kids' classrooms, and I can't tell you their names. I could barely put them out of a lineup if I had to, like their names of their classmates and stuff. Like, it's just people, and I'm there for a purpose, and I do whatever I have to do, and then I get out. You know, and it's just one of many ways that being a parent is like being a serial killer, I think.
The thing is Lonnie Franklin kept mementos, though. He kept.
Well, yeah, he took his photos, but he took his photo. I mean, somebody who is dying looks very different from how they do alive. You know, and so it's hard for me to know, like, whether he actually recognized them or not. And so I don't know. Like, for me, I have a really hard time even now. Like, if I see your photo, it's hard for me to recognize you in person. And I really confirmed this over the summer. I went to the True Crime Podcast Festival in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And the number of people where I was like, I had to wait for them to speak before I could recognize them, even though I had seen their photo before.
Right.
Just because my brain doesn't function that way. And so if I see you in out of context or in a different context, then I don't recognize you. So that may be at play to a degree, or he's just maybe not entirely sure what all they have. So you just deny everything, and you deny everything until you're absolutely certain they have you. And even then you may still deny because he's waiting to find out how much they have on him. And that's part of what makes me think there's a lot more that we don't know about. Because he's so cagey about the ones that we've got him cold.
Well, based on the things that they found in his house, too, because when they searched his home, it took 3 days. They found more than 1,000 pictures of women in various stages of undress. Some looked unconscious. Some could have even been dead already. And also recovered were hundreds of hours of X-rated home videos that were taken inside his home. And according to an article from December 2010 in the Daily Beast, the search of his house, in addition to the hundreds of pictures and videos, were numerous handguns, women's jewelry, and other personal effects belonging to some of his known victims. And it was a lot to go through, but every single piece of evidence that they found, in all of this, the one piece that they did find was the Polaroid picture that he snapped all those years ago of Anitria Washington, his lone survivor. And she is clearly not doing well in this picture. Her eyes are closed, she's slumped, and she's bleeding from her chest. So the LAPD eventually made public 180 of the pictures found in Franklin's homes with hopes of identifying them. And I believe to this day, they've either all been identified as alive and well, some have passed away of natural causes, all but about 30 of them. So, like we've heard about serial killers in the past, they like to keep things that belong to women, whether they're pieces of jewelry or ID cards or photos, they're keepsakes of their handiwork. Why do you think a serial killer does this?
I mean, it's your masterwork, but you can't keep it in your house. So how do you, for one, it's like a souvenir, a little memento of a trip you took, as it were. And for another, I mean, it's like,
this stuff was all hidden away too. It was
right. No, you
inside.
Just kind of, you sneak in and you find it and you peek at it when you really need to, when you're all alone. And that's where, like, the addiction analogy is sort of comparable to me, is that's like taking a little hit, like a little bump, when you're not going to go out and get totally high, or maybe you're not going to use heroin, but you'll go drink instead, or something where you want a little bit of mind altering, but not all the way. Like, that's what that feels like to me, is ways to cut down, a reduction model rather than an abstinence model. Mm-hmm. That's what I think they're doing.
By revisiting all of his little souvenirs and keepsakes. Interesting. Yeah.
And gross. Gross.
A lot of serial killers do it too. It's weird.
Yeah. No, everybody has a collection of something.
That's true, I guess.
Like some of us just have a collection of, I don't know, episodes we've released.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like on my computer, I have all of the episodes I've released, but I also have all of the Audacity recordings as well as MP3s. And so Audacity is the file a lot of us use, which creates these really weird proprietary files that are different. You can't use them anywhere else. You have to export the files so that other people can hear them, blah, blah. There's no reason on earth for me to keep them. And in fact, I should get rid of them because they take up a crap load of space.
I've had to start getting rid of mine too, my GarageBand files.
Right. And it's hard to do because I don't know. Like there's
always there. It's always
there's no use for them.
Yeah.
There's no use for me to.
I have kept all of my scripts so I can re-record any episode I want. So,
and that's the kind of thing, is like, do you really desperately need this thing? No, but you keep it as like a souvenir, sort of a proof of work that was done, or I don't know. It's not entirely logical. And as well, like, I'm a knitter, and whenever you're done with a project, you're left over with like this tiny little ball of yarn that isn't enough to make a thing, but it's too much to just throw out. Like, you keep it anyway, like, and then later I'll find it and I'll be like, oh, I know exactly what that was.
Right.
And so it's that kind of thing. Like, humans tend to have some sort of collection.
So Lonnie Franklin, he was a pretty unassuming guy for the most part. He was a mechanic, so he was also known for helping out his neighbors if they needed something worked on. He was very helpful. It seems as though that they knew he was a little bit shady, like maybe some of the car parts that he had may have been stolen, but all in all, nobody would say that they were ever afraid of him. And if anybody ever knew about his proclivity for sex workers or violence, nobody was willing to say. So, could he have been operating like this for nearly 3 decades, right under the nose of his wife and children, and they never knew?
Why not? Like, nobody expects your spouse to be a serial killer. Not really.
Right.
You live with somebody, you think you know everything about them. And we don't expect liars. Like, we try to steel ourselves for it, and some of us are more suspicious than others. But you don't really expect people to lie to you. And, you really don't expect people to kill other people around you. Do you know what I mean? And so that idea of, could you get away with it under the noses of people? Sure. Easy.
And the sad part is once they put it all together, that it was Lonnie Franklin responsible for all of these killings, they came to realize that many of his victims were last seen in very close proximity to his house. As a matter of fact, the house that Anitria Washington took police to where she said her attacker had stopped and said it was his uncle's house, that house was only 3 doors down from Franklin's house. And they said they surveilled the home for several weeks and came up with nothing. And I wondered about that and how they could have a description of a guy, how they had the kind of car he drove, and they sat there for a month watching his house 3 doors over and saw nothing. And then I thought, again, maybe he laid low because of a survivor. I don't know. I again, maybe the police didn't investigate as thoroughly as they're claiming to have, because I can't imagine they would sit there for a month and not see an orange Pinto driving by.
Well, I mean, it depends a lot on, like, it depends on the neighborhood, but from what the photos I've seen of the neighborhood, it's pretty residential, and you know, it's not ghetto right there. And so, like, with that, like, I live on a street that's, you know, just comparable in terms of the distance between houses is all, but we totally, like, the space in front of our house is sort of for my husband's car. Like, it's sort of understood by the neighbors. And so if somebody else parks there, you know something weird is going on. You notice other cars in the neighborhood. And if somebody parks, like, across the street or down a couple doors, I notice it if I'm driving. Like, oh, I wonder whose car that is. You know, so-and-so is having a party. Like, that kind of mindset. Yeah. It's really, really hard to do any sort of surveillance in a residential neighborhood without being noticed. And all you got to be is noticed very briefly and once, and it can totally encourage this guy to go under.
I think that this neighborhood would probably have more foot traffic and car traffic going by randomly. It's a neighborhood. It's residential, but there's oftentimes those areas are impacted with lots of cars, especially if there's apartments too nearby.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Is I don't think this was an apartment sort of neighborhood. I think it was single family residences, right. And you know, surveillance has to be done stationary.
Yeah.
You know, because otherwise you miss stuff. Like, if they're truly doing surveillance and not drive-bys. My suspicion is that, first of all, they were doing drive-bys, and they were probably doing it with marked vehicles. So all it takes is him looking out once and being like, oh, how come they're driving by my house 3 times in a day? That could have been how he knows he has a survivor or somebody saw him. That could have been how he knew to go under.
So, other confirmed victims, investigators believe Franklin is responsible for as many as 25 unsolved murders, 11 of them they believe having taken place during the so-called break that he was on. 5 or maybe 6 of them, which I believe were confirmed to be victim of his, were not included in the charges due to time and cost, and they did okay it with the families. 5 of their names were presented to the jury during the penalty phase of the trial that he went on to face, and that included Georgia May Thomas, who was shot twice in the chest and dumped in an industrial yard surrounded by garbage. Franklin's DNA was found on her. 28-year-old Inez Warren was found in an alley in Gramercy Park, also shot in the chest. 21-year-old Sharon Dismuke was shot twice in the chest and dumped at an old abandoned gas station. She had a rag stuffed in her mouth. 18-year-old Aaliyah Marshall disappeared in 2006, and 31-year-old Relenia Morris disappeared in 2005, and their bodies were never found. But Aaliyah's high school ID and a picture of Relenia and her driver's license were found in a refrigerator in Lonnie Franklin's garage that was full of other items that he kept from his victims. So they pretty much confirmed that these people were linked to him. His trial began in early 2016. He was charged with 10 killings and 1 attempted murder. It lasted about 3 months, and the jury deliberated all for a day and a half, and they came back with their verdict of guilty on May 5th, 2016. A month later, on June 6th, he was sentenced to death. Today, Lonnie Franklin is 67 years old, and he resides on death row at San Quentin State Prison, but he will most likely die of natural causes, as the death penalty is currently on an indefinite moratorium. In every election in California, there's always a measure on the ballot to strike down the state's death penalty statute, but it never passes, so it's always in limbo. And that's it.
Yeah.
Lonnie Franklin.
I hate him so much.
He was an awful person.
I hate him.
He was awful to look at, too.
He is awful to look at, partly because he's so normal looking.
Yeah.
You know, but the thing is, that's, you know, we collectively, true crime people, cover the same serial killer cases over and over again because those are the ones we know about, because those are the ones that stand out. But there are a ton of other active serial killers at any time, and the reason that we're not covering them is because they haven't been caught yet, because they're getting away with it. And they're getting away with it because they're nondescript.
Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of terrifying.
He was hiding in plain sight pretty much for 30 years.
Right.
Right there. Anyway, that's Lonnie Franklin, the Grim Sleeper.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for all your insight. You definitely brought up some points that my mind doesn't even go. I'm more emotional. You're very clinical.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, you have to be. Like, it's interesting. The same thing happened the last time that you and I recorded, is that there are times where you go into details that make my brain be like, oh my God, just because I tend, in my show, I don't often go there. Mm-hmm. Especially because I've kind of drifted away from true crime, and so I'm talking to people who generally are not murderers as far as I know. And, you know, so on the one hand, there's more of a shock value because I'm out of the field now. But then when I get back into that mindset, it's pretty easy to do. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's very easy to kind of get right back into that headspace and
oh yeah,
be like, yeah, this is why he keeps the souvenirs, and this is why he wore her head as a hat, you know?
Oh my God. That's so, oh my God. I don't even think about those. I don't like talking about those aspects too much. I always think about reasons why, what's going on in their mind and how they're feeling. I think about how the killer is feeling, like if he's angry, or if he's, you know, in a blind rage, or if he's feeling aroused, or, you know, if he's happy, or I don't know.
But those are things that you can't know until you know exactly what he did.
Yeah.
You know, and
he's a coward, and he'll never say.
No, exactly. And so you focus on what you do know. And that's what, you know, for instance, that's why I can guess that here's a person who is probably not so much based on prior fantasy, so much as impulse. You know, based on the fact that he used a gun, based on the fact that, you know, he was not choosing a real specific victim type, so much as victims of opportunity. Like, yeah, he chose race, but at the same time, a black man in the 80s is not going to be able to get a white woman into his car as easily. You know, in South Central, race relations were a real big issue at the time. So that could have been a case of practicality rather than preference.
There aren't that many African-American serial killers either.
Well, again,
not at that time.
Not that have been caught.
Right.
But, you know, there's a lot of talk about, like, serial killers kill within their race. Well, okay, they do because interracial couples are, even now, still noticed, if not noteworthy. Do you know what I mean? Like, people often will notice a black man walking with a white woman, even if they don't have the same, like, shock value that it used to. And in the 80s, it had a big frickin' shock value. And, you know, so if a serial killer is going to be sort of successful in what they want to do, you have to fly under the radar. And so you have to be with people of the same race. And you have to behave in certain very normal ways until...
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for doing this with me. And I look forward to hearing this episode and getting our listeners in on it, because I know that they really enjoyed our first one on Rodney Alcala way back when.
I know, right? Like a year ago.
It's been a while, yeah.
And you know, and we'll start figuring out who next as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to find. I like doing the serial killers with you because I don't do them on my own, and you definitely give me a different perspective on it.
I mean, that's both wonderful and awful. You know what I mean?
Well, you think differently than I do, so.
Yeah, no, it's true. So awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Roseanne. Tell my listeners where they can find you.
I am at California Dreaming. My website is www.orbitaljigsaw.com. All of the episodes are there. You can find me on Facebook, the California Dreaming Facebook page, both the official page and the discussion page. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Just search for the show. I'm everywhere.
And you're awesome. So
I'm in Kate's group too, so hit me up there too.
You are. It's wonderful.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. I would like to thank Kate for taking the time to discuss the Grim Sleeper with me. I've actually been wanting to talk about the case for quite some time. Though serial killers are not always my favorite topics to discuss because there are just so many victims and so much time and space to cover, I like to focus on victims as much as I can, and sometimes there are just so many it's overwhelming. Especially with this guy, because it was always important to me to want to bring about awareness to the victims of Lonnie Franklin, because they had been overlooked for too many years. The police didn't necessarily do anything wrong. I just think they could have done more. And that will bring this bonus episode of California Dreaming to a close. I would encourage you to come on over to our Facebook discussion group if you haven't done so yet and request to join. It is there that we discuss the cases that we cover. We share our thoughts and opinions, not only about our show, but any other podcasts that you listen to, documentaries that you've watched, books that you've read, as well as current news stories, posts about your pets, funny memes. Please come on over and feel free to share. You can also go over to the show's Facebook page, like that page, and leave us a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. This week, for our birthday shoutouts, I would like to wish a happy birthday to the following dreamers: Danny J., whose birthday was on October 1st, Jessica L. on the 2nd, Elizabeth C. and Anya K. on the 4th, Julie H. and Monica D. on the 5th, Monica J. on the 6th, Melanie D. on the 7th, and Gracie B. and Karen V. on the 8th. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to. We have an eclectic roster of shows with content including true crime, history, sports, entertainment, gaming, and social media. So visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You will find links to all of our podcasts, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store on TeePublic. There are a couple of new California Dreaming designs. You can get coffee mugs, t-shirts, hoodies, all sorts of stuff to represent your favorite true crime podcasts. Again, that's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.